Hello, my dear friends. You're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 20th of November. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first, we're going to start with Odessa. If you remember, yesterday we discussed the situation that there were strikes in Odessa about the fact that this town is without electricity for more than 4 or 5 days. Some regions have been cut off from electricity for, I believe, maybe a week or something like this. And there was a lot of noise about this situation, so that's why the Ukrainian authorities decided to send, let's say, anti-strike forces, their SBU forces. This is their special forces like KGB in USSR or FSB in Russian Federation, so SBU. And as far as I understand, according to information we have, these forces have arrested the head of those strikes. And if we're talking about today, I haven't received any updates about the fact that there were some strikes in Odessa. Furthermore, the local authorities promised to the locals that they will try to solve this issue. But we understand and we know that during the previous months, a few months ago, maybe a week ago, Zelensky decided to cut any. So he's very strong, he's very aggressive about the media sphere and so on, and he tries to reduce the private media news updates from Ukraine. So the Ukrainian authority tries to show just their own picture and not to allow the Ukrainians to show the real situation in Ukraine for one purpose, to avoid or to reduce the chances of strikes. And there was some updates in Odessa, and from that moment we haven't received anything. So we'll follow this situation. Now let's move from Odessa to Kherson district, Kherson, Zaporozhye, to, let's say, west front line. And if we take a look at this map, we're going to see that there are almost no changes. The Russians attack at Charkov. This is the main area where the Ukrainians train their Marines. They're planning to use these Marines to cross the Black Sea and to take control over this Kinbur land, over this area. So for now, there were no updates about the loss from the Ukrainian side, but the Russians control this area. And I believe that anyway, the Ukrainians will do more attempts in this direction. So for now, there are no updates. Also, there, as you can see, some updates that the Russians attacked some headquarters, some Ukrainian position with artillery, without updates about the number of losses and so on. There was an update that the Ukrainians sent some drones in this area trying to discover the Russian position and so on. But for now, no active movement from the Ukrainian side to cross Dnipro. A lot of updates are coming from Energodar. The Ukrainians attack Energodar during this day, yesterday, the day before, and as you can see, there is a fire icon right on the nuclear power plant. There is a nuclear power plant in this area. And the Ukrainians are attacking the storage of the old nuclear fuel, and it's a very dangerous situation. And the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported about that fact. They report about that fact almost every single day. And as you can see, the Ukrainians are using almost the same tactic in Energodar as they use with Kherson district, because if you remember, the Russians, according to the Russians, like their version, they left this bank of Dnipro River because of the fact that it was very difficult to supply and support this area. And we know that the Ukrainians, we can say that the Ukrainians, if the thing that the Russian told is true, was true, that means that Ukrainians won this battle just with two things. The first one, they were attacking Antonov Bridge that connected Kherson with the east bank of the river, and they attacked Novokakhovka Bridge. So the Ukrainians were attacking bridges using HIMARS systems, and those actions forced the Russians to leave this Kherson region and left bank of the river. So that was the situation. Now the Ukrainians are doing the same thing. They're attacking the nuclear power plant, the storage, with one purpose: to force the Russians to leave this area. And the Ukrainians understand that they are able to do this. First of all, if the Russians want to, let's say, to save this town or to secure this town, they need to push the Ukrainians far from this bank of the river. They need to take control over Zaporozhye. They need to take control over Kryvyi Rog. So they need to push Ukrainians very far from this bank of the river. And we understand that it is possible, but maybe not even in the next year. So the Ukrainians feel themselves very safe. They can attack. They're doing this. And the main purpose and goal of those attacks, of course, is to force the Russians to step back from Energodar. It doesn't mean that the Russians need to leave entire area. The main thing the Ukrainians want just to force them to leave, maybe to demilitarize this area and to return this power plant under the control of the Ukrainian forces. If we're talking about Zaporozhye, today we got a very interesting update that the Russians attacked some industrial zone in this area and they attacked the military plant that produced the engines for rockets, for missiles, for aircrafts, for helicopters and so on. This plant, as you can see, is located very close to the front line. The Russians have their people there, so they found, they spotted, and they attacked and they destroyed. This plant has the title of Motor Sichus, the biggest Ukrainian military company who produce a lot of equipment, a lot of things for the army. So as you can see, the Russians try to reduce the Ukrainian industrial possibilities and military possibilities as well. And if we're talking about the changes on the front line, on the ground, there were no changes. The Ukrainians didn't make any attempt, the Russians didn't make any attempt. For now, everything is stable, everything is secured. If we're talking about the South Donetsk region, as you can see, there are a lot of icons in this area. The Russians didn't make any attempt of offensive operation in this area, just a regular front lines battle, but they reported that the Ukrainians made a few attempts and the Ukrainians were attacking in direction of Rovnopol, this town, and in direction of Vremivka, so in these two directions. So the Ukrainians were trying to attack, but those attacks were repulsed by the Russians, and this report confirms that the Russians do have some control over Vremivka tactical bridgehead. We got this update a month ago, but I'm not sure why the Russian source map hasn't been updated yet. Maybe they need more evidence, or at least I believe that in this situation the Russians should at least update their gray line, trying to show that Vremivka at least is in the gray zone. So the Ukrainians were trying to attack Rovnopol, this town, and Vremivka, like from two sides, but the attack were repulsed. A lot of interesting updates are coming from Pavlovka Ugledar, from battle for Ugledar. The Ukrainians also made a few attempts of counteroffensive operation in direction of Pavlovka, in direction of Nikolskaya, Vladimirovka, Solotka, this town, trying to pin down the Russians, not to allow them to establish stable positions, trying to force to leave this position and so on. But all those attacks were repulsed, and the Russians reported that during the previous hours, as a result of those attacks, the Ukrainians lost around 120 soldiers and something around 12 armored vehicles. But the most important update that the Russians continue or activated or make more intensive attacks against Ugledar. During the previous 2 weeks, I've seen a lot of video confirmation updates how the Russians, using their drones, using their smart shells, were attacking this area, and there were a lot of video confirmation of Ukrainian loss of the tanks, of artillery systems, and so on. As you can see from one side, Ugledar is a very small town. There are a lot of high buildings in this area. This town is located on the landfill, on the highland, and this area is much higher than the area on the south, and it's very easy to control the Russian movements in Pavlovka, Nikolskaya, so it's an important town. But from the other side, you see that this is a very small town. Very small town, very compact, and it's very difficult to hide equipment there. So to hide equipment there, I believe that Ukrainians need, let's say, to destroy, or not to destroy, just to ruin, the first floors of the buildings, or not rebuild the first floors of the buildings, and to hide equipment, tanks, on the first floors of the building. So just to destroy the wall, to force it, not to allow to break the entire building, and to hire tanks on the first floors and something like this. But this town is very compact, very small, and today we got a lot of the video updates, how the Russians were attacking the towns that located on the border of this town. There were like a video of big buildings, 9, 10, 12 floors building, and some floors on the higher floors were completely burned, were completely covered with black fog and something like this. So the Russians started suppressing the fire position in these buildings. On this side of Ugledar, let's say not this one, but this one, where the highest buildings are. And slowly, very slowly, but the Russians are planning to move furthermore. If we're talking about Ukrainian military authorities and Western military authorities and Western authorities, I see that nobody understands what the Russians are planning to do next. Because there are a lot of options, a lot of updates. Now I understand that the Western commanders, authorities, military authorities, now is in the same situation as the Russians used to be before the Ukrainians started their counteroffensive operation in August. They knew, the Russians, that the Ukrainians would start counteroffensive operation. They made some rotation process. They deployed more forces in Kherson. They moved some forces from Kharkiv, but they weren't for 100% sure where exactly the Ukrainians would start their offensive operation. And as a result of that, we see that the Russians lost a lot of territories. They lost in the entire Kharkiv area. Now there are a lot of they lost the north part of Donetsk Republic. I'm talking about Liman. The Russians now have a lot of problems near Kremenaya, on the Svatovo-Kremenaya front line, and the Russians lost the capital of Kherson district, and they were forced as a result of those offensive operations. Now the Western countries, the Western commanders are in the same situation. They know that the Russians moved their forces from Kherson district. We discussed many times about deployment in Zaporozhye, in Donetsk, everywhere, all over the front line, but they still don't understand where exactly the Russians are planning to attack. And at least if we're talking about the open sources, the military experts, the military authorities from Ukrainian side, they say that they see the movements, but they don't understand where exactly the Russians are planning to attack. So we'll see. Let's follow this situation. If we're talking about Donetsk, Donetsk is under very heavy fire, as you can see, but there were no progress, no updates from the front lines, from Marinka to Avdiivka. As you can see, no icons, no updates, nothing from this area, and so no pictures. So I believe that maybe the Russians took a small pause. They got control over Opotnaya. Now they need to get some rest, maybe to change the forces, to send the force from Opotnaya to rest, and to move more rotated forces and so on, and to start the next week the clearing of Vodyane. And the Russians need to complete these 3 towns: Nivolskaya, Pervomayskaya, Vodyane. And as soon as they do this, we can turn the page in this story for Battle for the North, or the first chapter of Battle for Avdiivka. But for now, they're just in the middle of this chapter. So let's see what is going to be next. Now we are moving to Bakhmut. Today we got a lot of very interesting updates from Bakhmut, by the way. First of all, today, as you know, Bakhmut is under fire, is under attack. And if we're talking about the Russians, Wagner's, it's like PMC, private military company, storms Bakhmut these days. And if we're talking about the Ukrainians, there are a lot of forces in this area. Our 3 famous mechanized brigade, and one of mechanized brigade 93rd is near Solidar. There are a lot of territory defense forces, a lot of assault battalions, motorized brigades. So there are a lot of forces, special forces, and so on. If we're talking about the Russians, there is some tactical battalion groups, Wagner forces, Wagner attack battalion tactical group, as you can see, 6 Cossacks motorized regiment. And the thing is that today I got update that the Ukrainian command, or maybe Western commands, I can't tell exactly, decided to move in this direction their own PMC. And this PMC has the name of Mozart. So From the Western countries, from Ukrainian side, in Bakhmut, there is Mozart PMC, and if we're talking about Russians, there is Wagner PMC. So two musicians, two PMC who has the title of some connected with the music and so on. And the thing is that this is a very smart decision. First of all, we understand that Wagners showed themselves pretty good during this conflict. If we're talking about the entire conflict since the beginning of the February, since the beginning of the special operation, I haven't heard and I don't remember even an example when the Wagner PMC were forced to retreat or leave their position. They've never give up, they've never lost their lands, they're just pushing and taking new territories. If we're talking about Wagner PMC, of course it's private, but these days they are working for Russian Federation, and anyway it's Russian private PMC, a private military company, and of course they're trying to achieve the Russian goals. And if we're talking about the Ukrainians, they sent Mozart PMC, this the Western PMC to be more precise. The owner or the creator of this PMC is the United States colonial, and the main goal of the Western PMC Mozart is not to hold Bakhmut. I understand this. The main goal of this PMC is to damage Wagner PMC as much as possible and just to get some kind of advertisement. You know that the best, I believe that Wagner is one of the best PMC in the world, and of course if you want to get some pie from this market, I'm talking about Mozart PMC, you need to show yourself, and the best way to do this is to damage the Russians, the Wagner one of the best, and to show the world that we also can do something. So the Ukrainians sent, or the Western commander sent the Mozart PMC in this area, and I believe that the next week we are going to see very, very hot battles in this area. I believe that this Mozart PMC has chances to achieve some success just for one reason. If we're talking about the Russians, I'll repeat myself, the Russians need to take Bakhmut. But if we're talking about Mozart PMC, they need to damage the Russian PMC, not to hold Bakhmut. So that's why they are more flexible, they're more mobile, and so they have some chances. Let's follow. Let's follow and let's take a look at this battle between Russian and United States PMCs in this area, and I believe that sooner or later we're going to see who's the best. And we're talking about the numbers. The Wagners haven't provided any numbers, and the Russian Ministry of Defense haven't provided anything as well. Very interesting updates are coming from Kramatorsk, and today the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that they managed to destroy 2 HIMARS systems in Kramatorsk. They haven't provided, of course, no videos about that, but they told us that they managed to do this. Very interesting. Now we are moving to Kupyansk-Liman frontline, Kremenaya, Kupyansk, Kremenaya, Svatova, to this area. You know what? The thing is that, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense, their report during the previous 24 hours of the Ukrainians' attacks in this area, the Russians didn't make any attempt. They were just defending or something like this. The Ukrainians lost just 50 soldiers and something around 11 armored vehicles. So we can say that the Ukrainians lost not much. But the thing is that we hear this report of Ministry of Defense every day, and every day they're saying that they're repulsing their attacks, Ukrainian attacks, that they're winning and so on, but the situation on the ground shows a little bit different picture. We see that the Russians are saying that they're repulsing the Ukrainian attacks, that they defeat them, that they deal them a lot of damage and so on, but the maps shows that maps updates, and the updates moves to Svatova very slowly. I don't know, meter by meter, another repulse by another repulse, but the Ukrainians are moving in direction of Svatov. And today, the Russian source map has been updated. As you can see now, they're showing us this back. This small back shows that at least the towns like Patalakhovka, Raigorodka, within the gray zone, the Ukrainians reached the towns by the name of Nezhirina. They maybe are able to encircle Kolomichuka from the south, and to tell the truth, if the Ukrainians entered Patalakhovka, that means that there are no more 10 towns in front of Svatova. there is a road P60, P66 or R66, and after that is Svatov. The distance between the Ukrainians and Svatov is around 10 kilometers, and that means that Ukrainians are able to reach Svatov with the regular artillery. They don't, with old Soviet artillery systems, they don't need HIMARS to attack Svatov and to pin down the Russian position. So from one side, we see that the Russians says that they stop the Ukrainians, repulse the attack every single day, that they deal them damage, that Ukrainians have losses every day. But from the other side, we see that maps updates every day, and we see that these updates every single day leads us close in direction of Svatov. The same situation near Kuzyumovka, this railroad, the Ukrainians still can't cross this railroad. If we take a look at the Western sources map, we're gonna see that they shows the front line in this area pretty accurate. As you can see, this is the railroad that Ukrainians can't cross to attack Kuzyumovka. The Russians hold this area, and but anyway, the Ukrainians has position a little bit to the north, but in this area they can't cross Arlyanka, Yagidne, Zatushi. So these fortifications, the Russians are there, and to attack a little bit to the north from this area won't bring the Ukrainians a lot of benefits, because if the Ukrainians attack a little bit to the north, let's say trying to encircle Arlyanovka, so in this case the only thing they will be able to do it is to attack in direction of Vremivka, and as you can see there are no roads, no, just the field, just water reserves, so on. So it's not an option to attack between these two rivers. So it will be the same story, another two rivers, a lot of water, and to attack Nizhnya Duonka, it's highly unlikely that Ukrainians won't do this. But they need to develop their offensive operation in this area on this side of this railroad. I know that railroad is always a little bit on the land field, and it's very difficult to cross this territory. This area is always under drone control, and as you can see, the front line moves along this railroad, and the Ukrainians need to take control over this damned Kuzyumovka and try to attack like on this area in direction of Sosnovo and Svatov from the north on this side of railroad. So we see another barrier. We used to that just the rivers is the only barrier, but now we see that the railroad is also some kind of barrier for forces to develop their offensive operation. So for now on, while the Russians control Kuzyumovka, the Ukrainians are not able to develop their offensive operation in direction of Svatov. But as we discussed, there are a lot of updates around this area, and the Ukrainians say that they control this territory and they're right in front of Svatov. But it's very difficult to move a lot of tanks, armored vehicles through Raigorodok. They can build some pontoon bridges, but even if they have pontoon bridges, they won't be able to collect enough of manpower, the critical mass, to develop their attack further. So that's why they decide they need to have some bridgehead without any barriers to attack from the north. So this is the only thing that stops the Ukrainians on this phase of Svatov defense or offensive operation in these days. Now let's move further to the Kharkiv area, and these days there were a lot of updates, a lot of situation along the border with the Russian Federation. As you can see, the Ukrainians, they got control over this territory. They pushed the Russians back on their territory, and now there are like artillery duels, and the Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours they managed to attack and destroy two howitzers M777 that Ukrainians were using to attack Belgorod and the towns in this area and so on. So this situation about Kharkiv. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.